Hello, welcome to this week's CleaveTech Tech Tip again. And we're back on the bench after the BSCRA National Championships, which is definitely the most prestigious event in the whole of the UK every single year. Unfortunately, we were missing a couple of our top-ranked drivers, one due to COVID and one due to family issues. But obviously we wish them speedy recovery and hope that they can be back to racing soon. Here is the winning 132nd Eurosport car. It is mine. I was lucky enough to win 32nd Eurosport, but this video is not about this car. You can see the race wasn't particularly straightforward. There's lots of issues here. I'll explain those in a minute. It's more about preparing your car in the service break and what I did. So what I've done is I've managed to do a time-lapse video of all my servicing that I did between the heat and the final, and I'm going to talk you through it. So let's get on with it. So you can see the race itself wasn't all that straightforward. There's a few little holes in here and you can see these marks here. This is the telltale sign of the body going through the gears in a big accident. And yes, it did. The pinion came through this hole here. So I had to extract the whole back axle to get the body shell out, but luckily it survived just enough. You can see there's a rip in the side here. It's pushed all the way that through. It's not been totally plain sailing either. Big chunks out the front of the body shell here. Few dents around there from accidents, but I managed to have enough pace to claw it all back and still win the race. If you haven't seen my video on preparing for the 32nd Nationals, I'll put a link on the screen here. It's a two-part video, so there's a link to part one. But take a look at that first, because I give you some tips and hints on how you can prepare for a big race. And some of those preparations, in terms of my body shell preparations, etc., probably help me survive without having to totally replace the body shell and lose even more time. If you want to watch the live stream from each one of the 3 days of racing, then I'm going to put a link in the video description. So down below the video is a video description. You can open it up and you'll find a link in there to Chris Thomas's Twitch channel. And on there you can see a link to what happened each day. They're very long live streams, but you can scroll through them and find the racing that you want. So I'll also put a little link to say whereabouts in the video you can watch the overall finals. So to give you an idea of proceedings, we had a 1 minute qualification fastest lap. So we had to put our cars into technical inspection first. So they stay in part ferme. They then get put on the track for a 1 minute fastest lap. Then after that, the cars get taken away again. We still can't get them back as drivers. Then we run an 8x3 minute heat. Again, not allowed to really work on our cars unless the track power is on. After that, if you've made the top 8, in the overall, or the top 8 in our main grade, you can get your cars back for a 30-minute service session where you can do anything with your car, apart from obviously change the chassis, but you can change motor, braids, you can fix up anything that's bent or broken, change tyres, you could even change the body shell if you really wanted to, gears, etc, etc. So you get your car back for that 30 minutes to do all that servicing, but you also get a chance to practice on the lane that you're going to start your 8x4 minute final on. So again, you'll see, if you watch that long video, you'll see drivers practicing in that service break to test their car out again just before they put it back into technical inspection before the final. So what you're going to be seeing next is what happened during that service break for me between the heat and the final, and the kind of things I did to my car in between. So here is my pit space before the service break. So you can see going from the top, I've got my marble block that I'm going to be used to soldering things on and doing a motor change. I've got on the left hand side, I've got my tyre truer that's ready to skim tyres down a fraction to get them to be what I need them to be after I've analysed some ground clearance. I've got my little sponge and solder, and a little flux brush there. You can see next to the little blue sponge is a tiny little pot sort of on the same bit of plastic. That's got the tiny bit of flux in, so I don't make a mess everywhere on my bench. I've got a couple of Allen wrenches. I've got a nice flat clear block on the right hand side, some new braids, a new gear, and a little cotton bud for cleaning anything else up that I can't quite get a rag into. So I've just got my car back from Parc Fermé, and I start by cleaning off all the rubber from underneath the car and putting it on my flat block to check the ground clearance, so I can see how much my tyres have worn during the heat. Then that gives me an idea of perhaps what size tyres I should use to start the final with, which is a slightly longer race. After checking the ground clearance, I've now got in my head what ground clearance it finished on, so I'm now thinking perhaps what size tyres to start on. But while I'm thinking about that, I'm going to remove the body shell, going to remove the back axle, and I'm going to take out the motor that I used in the heats, because I'm going to put in another motor for the final that I've saved because it's rather quick. So I remove the motor by heating up the joint under the cam bearing first. Then I can quickly heat up the back motor joint and get the motor removed rather quickly without putting too much heat into the magnets. Once the motor is out, I can clean up the surfaces where the new motor is going to solder in place to make sure it's going to sit nicely in the chassis and line up with my gears properly. I should have got this ready beforehand, but I had to get it out of my box. It's a little bit of greaseproof paper that I use just to space the axle from the motor to make sure that the axle doesn't run on the motor when it's in place. It just puts a little bit of spacing in between the two and helps me align things better. I also removed the tiny little bit of brass tubing that was on the back of the previous motor because I'm going to use that to also brace the soldering joint on the new motor. So the new axle's in place, the new motor's in place. You can see the little bit of paper that I use in between the axle and the motor. So I'm holding it all in place and I'm going to solder it or tack solder it in place to test my gear mesh. So after checking the gear mesh the first time, just by hand, I'm just looking for a minute amount of play between the gear and the pinion. So basically the gear should just slide past the pinion lovely without any sort of play whatsoever, so that when it gets all the way in, there is a tiny amount of play in between the teeth. So I'm now applying a little bit of flux to the rear joint of the motor, and I'm going to solder that in place rather quickly so I don't overheat the magnets. I can then go back and solder the can joint a little bit better underneath the cam bearing just to make sure that the motor is held in nice and securely. With a knife, I'm just making sure that there's no solder underneath the chassis that's run out the bottom of the joint that could potentially reduce the ground clearance that I've got on the car or get in the way or rub on the track. So I then put the gear back in. I made another final check of the gear mesh that I wasn't 100% happy with. I'm sure it would have been fine, but I had plenty of time at this point, so I thought I would just reflow the joints on the motor again slightly just to improve that gear mesh. Now remember, I am looking for virtually no play at all between the teeth and the pinion. Literally the smallest amount of movement that you could possibly see without seeing no movement. After soldering the motor in, I quickly grabbed the sponge that I was using to clean the soldering iron tip with because it's full of water, and I just clean up the area around the motor on the chassis just to clean away any flux that I'd used. I'd only use a tiny bit of flux, but I like to clean it up so that the chassis doesn't go rusty. I then quickly dried the chassis with a piece of kitchen paper that I had in my box just to make sure that it wasn't wet anymore, and blew away all the water as quickly as I could. Next up, I reattached the lead wires to the new motor. I then spin the motor over to make sure there's no water left inside the motor. Then I fit the new gear again, and I spin it over again and just check that the gear mesh is all fine and I'm happy with the fitment of my new motor and my new gear. It's then time to fit the new tyres to the car and check the width of the back of the car to make sure it's going to pass technical inspection. In this case, I knew that the scrutineer's gauge was fractionally narrow, and they've been very, very strict on width of cars at the rear end. So I thought I just needed to take a tiny little bit off of the outside of the tyres in order to make sure it sailed through the gauge and I wasn't having to bring back the car from technical inspection to fix things. You will also notice that I didn't actually change the size of the tyres that I had all ready for the final, because I'd already planned roughly what my ground clearance was going to be, and I was quite happy on the handling of the car on the quite large tyres, so I knew that I didn't actually have to take those tyres down anymore and I would be fine for the final. Apologies for everything happening right at the top of the shot, some of it actually happening out of shot. That was the best position I could get my camera in, and obviously where I was sitting at the bench I tend to do things a little bit closer to me rather than leaning all the way over the bench. So unfortunately, yes, a lot is happening at the top of the shot. But the new pair of tyres are now fitted and I'm happy with the width that it's going to pass technical inspection. So I'm going to apply a little bit of oil to the bearings on the axle and a little bit of oil to the bearings in the motor. During the heat, I burnt a little bit of braid. Basically, the braids I used in the heat weren't new braids. They were actually pre-used and I'd done a bit of practice and I'd probably done another race meeting on them, to be fair. So they were probably finished off. So it was time for 2 brand new braids for the final. So now you can see me just doing the final preparation on the braids and making sure they are perfectly to the right length and that the end of the braid is slightly frayed to improve better pickup. After the braids were done, I started to reattach the body shell, but then I just thought, well, before I reattach the body shell, I'll just check over the chassis one more time just to make sure it sits nice and flat on the block and nothing's bent. So I put it back on the block and I find that one of the front ears is just a fraction bent, so I tweak that in my fingers and then I carry on putting the body shell back on the car again. You might also notice that the body shell already has the correct sticker on it, all ready to go onto my practice lane or my starting lane for the final. So I put a little bit of braid juice on the braids just to condition them, and away I go to test the car on the track to make sure that everything's all run in, to run the tyres in a little bit, to warm them up, to get a bit of a cycle through them and see how good the motor is, get my controller set up, just basically making sure everything's settled down and okay, all ready for the final before I take my car to technical inspection. So after testing my car on track, just before technical inspection closes, I come back to my box and I make some notes about what's happened during that time, and I recheck the ground clearance under the car just to make sure I know exactly what I'm starting with. I then double check the tightness of the rear tyres and the rear play to make sure I'm perfectly happy that they're nice and tight before I take it to technical inspection. And off I go to technical inspection, hoping that it will pass. I was actually the first one of the overall finalists to get my car into technical inspection and passed and ready for the final.
A few moments later.
So now there was time to tidy up my pit area after that quick service and make sure my pit box is ready for any mishaps that might happen during the final. So I'm generally just giving everything a bit of a clean. The old motor that I took out the car, I've given a bit of a clean up and so on before I put it back in the box so it's ready for servicing. I'm checking the size of the tyres that came off the car after the heat and making a note of the size of the tyre so I know for future reference and planning. I'm giving my marble block or granite block a little bit of a wipe down, make sure there's no flux left on the block, ready to go away. I've already put away my little balancer because I know I'm not going to balance any more wheels and tyres this weekend because this is the last class. And I'm finally putting away any other bits and pieces that I had left on my bench, like perhaps an extra spare gear that I now don't need. I've got enough in my pit box ready to go, a few spare washers, etc. So they've all gone away back in my box. So I've got a nice tidy work area in case I have to do any repairs on my car during the final. So I hope having a look at that time-lapse video has helped you understand some of the things that go on in the service break. You'll notice that here is the overall trophy. It needs engraving up to date. It's not been engraved for a while and it needs a nice polish. But you can see there are some quite prestigious names on that way back to the old days. Where are we back to? 1964, the first time that was run. It goes all the way through. Some very famous names in UK slot racing on that. Won multiple times by certain people. So quite a bit of history in this trophy here. You might have seen, again, a previous one of my videos where I introduced what my next tech tips are going to be about. I'll put a link on the screen up here now, so have a look at that. Something a little bit different. So take a look, that's going to be coming next week. Once again, hit the big C, please subscribe, take a look at the rest of my videos, and I'll be back again very soon. Thank you for watching.